And so we're studying the book of Tanya, which is the Bible of Chabad mysticism. And this is Rami Shapiro's modern version of the Tanya. I like what he did here because he simplifies it. I was thinking of something similar. I have many literary projects, and I thought of writing the Tanya in the form of poetic verse, which would make it a little bit more lyrical. But Rami Shapiro does a decent job. He's not exceptional. And I have some disagreements of how he interprets the passage, but be that as it may. We were talking last week about the nature of the soul. And when the author of the Tanya speaks of the soul, he speaks a lot about specifically the Jewish soul. Oy, the Jewish soul. Think about that for a minute. Is there such a thing as a Jewish soul? If you ask Maimonides, what would he say? Is there such a thing as a Jewish soul?
Why not? Yes.
No, Maimonides said that's pure nonsense, because a soul is spiritual to begin with. A spiritual being has its own identity. So there's no such thing as a Jewish soul. There's no such thing as a Christian soul or a Buddhist soul. They're just simply souls. A commonwealth of souls. And the rabbis seem to understand this as well, because they say that the righteous of all nations have a portion in the world to come. That's in the preamble to the ethics of the fathers. So it is not just Maimonides who believe that, but the earliest strata of the Mishnah also affirmed that belief. But the author of the Tanya argues for the existence of a Jewish soul. So when we talk about a Jewish soul, how do we understand Jewish soul? How should we understand it? Well, I guess the question here is, it's a matter of particularity. Is there something unique about the Jewish mindset? So if you look at it from that perspective, you could say there is a Jewish soul, so to speak, and just like there's a Christian soul or a Buddhist soul. That each religion has a spiritual identity. So if that's what the author of the Tanya is talking about, I don't particularly have a problem with what he's saying, and I don't think you should have a problem with that either. But the notion of a Jewish soul, it did not originate with this particular work. And if you take a look, for instance, in the writings of Judah Halevi, and as well as the Zohar itself, the Zohar is a remarkable book. It's the Bible of Jewish mysticism. I've often said that the Zohar reminds me of the girl with the curl. How is it like the girl with the curl? When she's good, she's very, very good. And when she's bad, what is she?
Horrible.
She's horrible. And there's some ideas in the Zohar that resemble that comparison. So the author of the Zohar believed very much in the existence of a Jewish soul, and that Jewish souls are innately superior to non-Jewish souls. Now, this kind of provincial. This is provincial thinking. It's spiritually provincial. And what is the problem with provincial thinking? Is that we, instead of focusing on what we have in common, we tend to focus on what we don't have in common. And a soul is a soul. And if you would have asked Aristotle about a Greek soul, he probably would have laughed at your face. So would Plato. But the author of the Zohar believes that there's a unique identity to the Jewish people. Again, if you talk about unique identity in a collective sense, you want to call that soul, I don't necessarily have a problem with it. The problem is that the author of the Tanya went so far to say that the righteous people of the Gentile world are innately inferior to Jewish people who have Jewish souls. Now, that's already crossing a red line, a theological red line. And there's a famous story of Shner Zalman of Liadi, the author of this work, the Tanya, that we're studying. And he was arrested by the Tsar Nikolai, I think it was. And he was charged with the accusation of supporting Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. Now, he used to send money to Palestine, and Palestine was under Ottoman control. And so enemies, Jewish enemies, wanted to see the rabbi arrested and thrown in prison for the rest of his life. And when the Russian authorities met the rabbi, they said, he doesn't look like your typical rebel. He seems like the last person in the world that would be guilty of treason. And so the Tsar himself went in secretly to meet with the rabbi, and he did not reveal his identity. And the old rabbi recognized right away that this was none other than the Tsar of Russia. And they started having a candid conversation about the Bible. And he asked him, do you believe everything that the Bible says is true? And so he said, absolutely. He said, well, let me ask you a question, Rabbi. Why does God say to Adam, where are you? Where art thou? Didn't God know? And so the rabbi proceeded to explain that if you believe that the Bible contains an eternal message, then the idea here is that the question that God is asking Adam is the same question that God is asking every human being. Where are you? How are you living your life? What have you accomplished? What are your life goals and ambitions? And too often we hide behind subterfuge, and we're hiding from ourselves, and in hiding from the deepest part of ourselves, we're also hiding away from God. And so the Tsar clapped his hands, and he said, "Bravo, Rabbi, bravo!" And they proceeded to have other discussions. And one of the discussions is, well, your book says there's something about a Jewish soul. Do you mean to say that Jews are superior to non-Jews? And since the rabbi had answered all the other questions of his interrogator, all he did was he just simply smiled. He says, "Do you really want me to answer that question?" And the interrogator said, "No, we're satisfied with what you've answered so far. Next topic." Okay, but we don't believe that a non-Jewish person is inferior to a Jewish person, especially if the individual happens to be righteous. And the fact is, you take a look at a lot of Jews in the world today, and I'm not going to mention names, but there's some Jews whose character is very, very, let's put it, less than desirable, less than admirable. Some Jews who are a disgrace to everything that Jewish values and Jewish tradition teaches. Harvey Weinstein, Epstein, people like that. But the list is not limited to just them alone. In fact, that's maybe one of the reasons why there's anti-Semitism in the world, because Jews don't always reflect the best image of their people and their tradition. So, does this mean that a person who is a pious Buddhist doesn't have a portion of the world to come? Maimonides says, look, there's nothing innately superior about Abraham in the Bible. The only reason why God chose Abraham is because he was a pious person who was looking for God. And Menachem Kellner writes in his theological works on Maimonides, he mentions a very wonderful teaching. In fact, I mentioned this in a lot of my writings. If God would have appeared to a sincere Navajo Indian who was searching for God, God could have made a covenant with the Navajo people just as easily as the Jews. Isn't that a great idea? Picture that. God speaking to a Navajo version of Abraham. And it's this is the kind of thinking that goes completely diametrically different in a different direction than Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. So I'm not here to be overly critical of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. What we're going to do is, and I'm going to make this suggestion, that whenever we study wisdom, and it doesn't matter whether it's the wisdom of the Bible, whether it's the wisdom of Aristotle, of Buddha, Lao Tzu, Sun Tzu, or the New Testament, or whatever, we are to take the embers of tradition, not its ashes. And Maimonides put that in slightly different words. We take truth wherever truth comes from, regardless of its point of origin. And so when we talk about Jewish soul, we're going to have to distill it, the concept, to make it a little bit more palatable for a modern reader. But if you go to a Chabad house, and you should ask the local Chabad rabbi if a Jewish soul is superior to a non-Jewish soul, don't be surprised by the answer that he will give you. Okay, now let's go back over here. So in chapter 2, which is found on page 62, I think. If you look in the far left corner of the PDF file, it should say God, wisdom, and your essential nature. We find that the soul comes from the breath of God. And he blew into his nostrils the breath of life itself. This teaching of Shneur Zalman of Liadi is not original to him. Philo of Alexandria said it 2,000 years ago. He says the essence of the soul reflects the inbreathing of God's innermost nature and being. And so this is why human beings resemble God. And it's the soul that resembles the divine. And the soul, of course, is the final frontier in terms of us trying to grasp its nature, which is still enigmatic even for people living today. But what the important point is that he who breathes from within. If you look, for instance, in the Bible, one of the most interesting metaphors we find is the subject of kiss. Now, what is kiss? Don't tell me keep it simple, stupid. That's not a kiss. Okay, a kiss. What happens when a man and a woman kiss each other? What happens when a person is resuscitating someone who is just drowned?
We share a breath.
It is the commingling of consciousness, the commingling of soul. That one soul can animate and revive another. This is powerful. And this is the unique distinction that differentiates human beings from planets or other forms of life even, is that human beings partake of God's own innermost being, more so than even just animals. And so the fact that we have a soul it becomes the vehicle through which we can discover God and divine wisdom. And he says the innermost essence manifests in you as divine wisdom. And the wisdom of God is not knowable the way other wisdom is knowable. For God is simultaneously the knower, the knowledge, and the known. I would explain this a little bit differently. I said that God is the knower, God is knowledge, and God is the process. Well, actually, you can say that God is the knower, God is the process of knowledge, and God is the known. So when we look at the world, this is kind of a very interesting mystical idea. I've discovered some parallels in Hindu theology over the years. And basically what he's saying is that there's a unitary consciousness that links God and the soul together. Or to put it in slightly different words, that the universe reflects God's desire to know himself. And that we have a capacity to know God because we somehow mysteriously partake in God's innermost nature. Let me use an illustration from Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton is a Christian mystic, one of the best Christian mystics I've ever studied. And he and Philo say the same thing. What did the serpent say to Adam and Eve?
Eat the apple.
Eat the apple, and what will happen if you eat the apple?
You'll be like God.
You'll become like God. All right, so if you're Adam and Eve and you hear that offer, what are you going to think?
Sure.
You say, who doesn't want to be like God? But the serpent, but the question we need to ask ourselves is the serpent telling the truth?
No. Rabbi, the serpent wasn't talking to Adam, it was talking to Eve.
Well,
and he said,
but they both acquiesced. So we're going to speak to them as a couple.
Right.
Okay? Now, so the question is, was the serpent being truthful here?
Kind of.
When you say kinda, is that like being kinda pregnant? You're either pregnant or you're not. So was the serpent being truthful?
No, he was lying.
How was he lying? And why was he lying?
Because, I mean, his purpose, his aim was to cause man to disobey God, which was a basic tenet in our relationship, is that we're obedient, be obedient.
No, but he was telling the truth.
No,
the disobedience was a different thing.
No, actually I agree with Gil.
The truth.
The serpent is lying here.
He's a liar.
Okay, and the reason why he's lying is because Adam at this point doesn't realize or understand that he's already like God. He did not have to disobey God to be like God. By disobeying God, he became less godly, less spiritual. So it was quite the opposite. And so what the author of the Tanya is telling us is by understanding the nature of our innermost being, that opens the possibility for us becoming godlike. Now, and how do we become godlike? Not in our thoughts, but in our actions. And if we learn to behave kindly and justly and compassionately, we become godlike. Now, he says the wicked people are people who generally are motivated by selfishness. They are a slave to their shadow self, to use Jung's language. There's every person, which the author of the Tanya is saying here, is a composite of light and darkness. Well, if you take a look at light and darkness, where do you see this theme? Star Wars, right? Where else do you see this theme? The Mysterious Trial of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And
see it everywhere, really.
And
Yin Yang.
the yin and yang. Well, yeah, you see it in a lot of different traditions. Is that human beings have a capacity for light and transcendence, and they also have a capacity for darkness and alienation. And the story of the forbidden fruit is basically a story how man became alienated from himself. And when a person is alienated from their innermost goodness, they become alienated from God. So when we take a look, for instance, on July 4th, that young person that went on a shooting spree, or any shooter, what we find here these are all telltale examples of individuals who have become so alienated to their own inner nature. They don't understand their own capacity for goodness. They see themselves in abysmal terms as creatures forged out of darkness. And when people have such a low self-image, they're capable of striking at life itself. And that's one of the things that the author of the Tanya is telling us, is that we have to recognize that we have a capacity for transcendence, which is rooted in the godly soul that God has given us. But it is also possible for us to be subject to forces of darkness when we don't understand who we are, when we become alienated to the soul that God has given us.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes, go for it.
So, I don't remember where I heard it exactly, but like how you just said that Adam was like God without realizing he was like God, because he already had the Yetzer Tov on the inside of him, but it wasn't until after the Yetzer Tov that the Yetzer Hara also went inside of him. Like at first it was just the Yetzer Tov, we just had a good inclination in us because we were more like Hashem, and then after they partake of the fruit, then the Yetzer Hara went from the outside of them to be on the inside of them, and then it just wrestles like the yin and yang inside of it.
Well, Martin Buber explains the idea in even simpler terms. He says when a human being is hiding from God, they're also hiding from themselves. And when in other words, if we're really, you have authenticity versus inauthenticity. And when we become inauthentic to the goodness that we have within ourselves, that allows the forces of evil to manifest themselves in our lives and in the world around us. And if we could learn to recognize that we're all cast in the image of God, then if we can learn to honor that image, the world becomes an altogether different and more enlightened place. Dr. Samwise, what do you say?
Well, can you hear me okay?
Sure, I'm clear.
I'll tell you that I was a little distracted, and so what is your question again?
Okay, let me mention my last point. What I'm saying is that the author of the Tanya is talking about learning to recognize that the core of our identity, our true identity, is grounded and rooted in God. That the soul that we contain is a direct manifestation of the divine.
Okay.
Okay, now, the opposite is also true. When we fail to understand that we're made in the divine image, then we have a misunderstanding of who and what we are. And that becomes, in many instances, a self-fulfilling prophecy for people that do bad things. So if an individual could recognize their inherent good nature, then the world becomes an altogether different and more enlightened place. What do you think?
Can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
Are you saying that a humanist, for example, is by nature susceptible to evil or wrong living or not the proper life.
Well, one of the nice teachings of the Hasidic movement stresses the idea that every person is capable of being holy, even an atheist. And the example which is sometimes given by the holy Yid, the Chose of Lublin, one of the great Jewish mystics of the early 19th century. He says that what does an atheist say?
I don't believe it.
Well, actually, let me backtrack this. He was the Chose of Lublin said to his students, "You can learn something holy from just about every person in the world." So they asked him, "What can you learn from an atheist?" Now they thought they had the rabbi stymied by this very, very matter-of-fact like question. And so the rabbi rubbed his beard and then he said, he said, the atheist can also serve God's purpose in a magnificent way. Because when you see a poor person on the street, what does the atheist say?
God bless you.
This poor Shlemiel, this poor Shmagegi, he's praying to God, and God is not going to answer him. And who is going to provide his needs? Who can provide his needs? By George, I'm going to provide his needs. Because if I don't provide his needs, sure as heck, God's not going to provide his needs. Now, he doesn't understand that he becomes the conduit through which God is providing his needs, which is the whole point of a mature spirituality. That you see the point here. And so a humanist can be very, very... a humanist who is ethical is more valuable to God than a theist who is unethical in his business practices and his interactions with people. Some of the worst people in the world are sometimes religious individuals. Why is that?
They're using God to promote their evil.
All right, let me ask you. Let me parse the question slightly differently. What's harder, being a good person to your fellow man or being a good person to God?
Good person to your fellow man.
Why?
Because a fellow man sometimes is evil and does bad things, and God.
Human beings are exasperating. Human beings have a propensity for acting like jerks. Giving God a daily sacrifice or a daily prayer, easy. It's much easier for people to be pious to God than it is to be circumspect in their own personal, interpersonal behavior with their neighbor. You see the point here?
I have a question.
Yes.
Like, okay, do you know how like the Ten Commandments, right? Like you have like 5 between us and God, and then like the other 5 between us and other human beings. But ultimately, aren't they all like? I know humans can be exasperating, like I get that, but it's like, but you can't really be religious if you're not ethical to other people. Like they're the same thing.
Well, what's worse, a sin between you and God or you and your fellow man? I've asked that question many times. What do you think, Fernando?
Between you and a fellow man.
Okay, a sin between you and your fellow man is worse for one important reason. Because a sin against your fellow man is also a sin against God. So if you don't observe Shabbat, if you don't keep kashrut, that's not necessarily a real major sin as it is failing to pay your workers on time. Failing to pay rent on time, like we have with the churches that rent from us.
Yeah, they're about 3 months behind. But
all right, so you see, dealing with human beings is certainly much more exasperating. Let's go back over here. So we have the in-betweener. We mentioned last week that the in-betweener is the person who recognizes that he has a capacity for good and a capacity for evil. And he's constantly struggling with his nature. This, I think, is real significant because many people don't recognize the need for struggle. What happens to people in general? What happens when an individual is tempted? All you have to do is watch Jerry Springer. What do the people on Jerry Springer say? I'm a guy. What else is a guy supposed to do? So they give in to every conceivable impulse. And women do the same thing. They're oftentimes not much better. And so the lack of struggle, in some ways, is very problematic. You should be wrestling with your conscience. If you're not wrestling with your conscience, if we're not wrestling with our conscience, then we're capable of doing terrible things. So the conscience is the watchdog. It's coincidentally, let me read you something I have in my final commentary. Okay, hold on a second. Let's see. Hold on. Bear with me just a moment. Give me just a minute. Let me just find it here. Okay. No, I just had it here. One second. Conscience.
You got too much on your computer, Rabbi.
No, I have too much in my brain. I just.
You're trying to do split screen?
Here it is. Here. This is one illustration. Philo talks about people who are guilty of perjury. And so he says that you might think that the person who swears falsely is at peace with himself, because who really knows, right? But he says his soul is full of chaos and confusion. The person labors under the accusation of his conscience and suffers from every kind of insult and reviling. Conscience can never be censored, for its basic nature despises anything that is false and inauthentic. Conscience loves only virtue and acts as the soul's accuser and judge as one. And when the conscience is violated, it blames, it impeaches, it is hostile. When conscience acts as a judge, it teaches, admonishes, and demands that the accused change his ways. If conscience succeeds in persuading him, the individual will find inner peace and joy. However, if he denies the voice of conscience, it will wage an endless and implacable war against him, never quitting him day or night. Conscience will inflict incurable wounds upon him until he destroys his miserable and accursed life. What do you think of that?
So is our conscience the divine spark of Hashem inside all of us?
Yes.
When did Philo write that?
He wrote that 2,000 years ago. What do you think of that comment, Dr. Samwise?
Well, I think it's a very graphic definition, so to speak, of what conscience is. You know, the conscience is kind of the purveyor of what you're doing right and wrong, and speaks to you of the way of proper action. Yes.
But he's saying that. But he's saying something more. He's saying that conscience is really the voice of God that we experience, and learning to recognize that will help us in our struggle against evil.
I didn't hear the word God in there, though.
God created conscience. Conscience didn't come out of the blue. Conscience is God's calling card. That's one thing that Philo says over and over again. And I think, for instance, when the angel speaks to Abraham, tells him, don't kill your child, that the angel here is a metaphor for the conscience that Philo is talking about. And learning to recognize our better angels will keep us along the straight and narrow more effectively. Liliana, what do you say?
Hi, Rabbi. I think it's true. I like that he say. I think in some way, our conscience is the way that God used to talk us or let us know when something is wrong. Because we cannot listen to somebody that says something that we're doing wrong, but our conscience always say that the truth when we're doing something wrong.
You know, that's absolutely true.
Absolutely true.
And I think too that is the way that God used to communicate with each person, even when that person doesn't have access to knowledge or the Torah or anything, but everybody can know inside when something is wrong or something is good. It's because our conscience.
Okay, Liliana, go off the speakerphone just for a minute so we don't have an echo. I'm not going to add something else here. That if you take a look, for instance, in the Bible, the story of God and Elijah. Remember, Elijah wanted to know how God was going to speak to him. So what did he expect to find? Well, he thought he would find God in the storm. I mean, after all, wasn't there a storm on Mount Sinai? And then he thought he would find God in the wind. And he didn't find God in the wind. And he didn't find the God in the shaking of the earth. Where does he find God ultimately? In the still
small voice.
In the still small voice. And so if you think of conscience as the still small voice of God, that's how we can discern God speaking to us in our lives. Now, let's go to the next chapter here in the book of Tanya. We're going to go to, if you go to page 63. No, I'm sorry, wrong. Page 64. It should say the three garments, thought, word, and deed. I really love this section here. Okay, one of the concepts that we find in Jewish mystical writings going all the way back to Philo of Alexandria and the Kabbalah is the idea that the soul has garments. Now, when you think about garments, what comes to mind?
Clothes.
What?
Your outer coating,
All right, so how does a policeman dress?
Well, in uniform.
In the uniform. And how does a doctor dress?
A white coat.
Okay, and how does a terrorist dress?
You got a beard like this.
Like George, but he hides his face, okay? If you take a look at just about every occupation, of course, Catholic priest wears the collar. Rabbis wear hats. Or yarmulkes, So we define people by their clothes. And so one of the things that the author of the Tanya talks about is what he calls the garments of the soul. And what are the garments of the soul? They consist of thought, speech, and action. Now think about why does he compare thought, speech, and action to garments? Well, I guess the next question which we must ask is the garment indicative of the person?
Yes.
All right, could a person be a doctor without dressing up in a white coat?
Yes. Yes.
Sometimes the doctor is off duty and he has to respond. Okay.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes, so Fernando has a question.
Okay, the priest in the tabernacle be a priest without the garment?
That's a good question. A priest without the garments, according to Jewish law, is not a priest. In fact, one of the things that invalidate a priest and the service, even if he does the service absolutely kosher and does everything correct, if the high priest is not wearing the priestly garments, and he had to wear 7 or 8 garments, even the ordinary priest had to wear a linen tunic. If he doesn't wear the garment, guess what happens? The entire service is invalid.
Rabbi,
Yes.
does that mean that if you do shacharit without your tefillin and your talit, is it invalidated?
You could say, I guess you could make that point if you want. The talit, the garments of the soul express who we are. They're right there, and yet the human being is more than just his garments, because every person is born naked in this world, right? So you could say the core identity is beyond clothes itself. You could dress up like anything if you want. You could dress up like a woman. You can dress up like a macho man. You can dress up like a baker or a butcher, a priest, or whatever. So you could say on one level, the garments are not really reflective of the essence of the person. They're just external manifestations of the identity. And in the ancient Greek writings, for instance, Euripides and Asclepius and Sophocles often wrote about the persona. What is a persona?
Rabbi, can I say something?
Yes.
So when you're talking about like the garments, I think it's kind of like, especially like here in America, it's like we always associate people with like their occupation versus like who they really are. So it's like you have the occupation of like a rabbi, priest, doctor, dentist, plumber, whatever.
Or a soldier,
But that's just, your occupation isn't, I mean, it's part of your identity, but it's not like who you are. Like your thoughts, actions, and deeds, like what you do, that's who you like really are. I mean, you're
okay. Well, what the Zohar is saying, or what the Tanya is saying, is that thought, speech, and action is how we reveal our character to the world around us. They reveal who we are and what we stand for. And one of the interesting concepts we find in the Zohar, just to mention this passage because it's interesting, is that the purpose of the soul is to acquire garments for it to absorb the divine light in the world to come. So if you think about garments, fundamental feature of clothing is protection, right? Doesn't clothing protect us from elements?
Mm-hmm.
if it's cold outside, going in your naked splendor is probably going to make you sick, right?
Mhm.
And what kind of garments do we wear in the summertime? Bathing suits,
Sandals.
sandals. We wear sombreros, especially and speak a lot of Spanish too. All right, you get the idea that the garments are a way of protecting us from the external environment. Now, if you live in a place like Africa, or in the Amazon desert, or even in Hawaii, nakedness is considered to be very, very normal. Which is kind of interesting when you think about it. When a person converts to Judaism, what do?
Mikvah.
They had to go to the mikveh. Now, in the old days, in the Orthodox days, they had to go naked into the mikveh. The Orthodox rabbis are supposed to be witnesses. Now, what happens when you have a beautiful young lady converting to Judaism? What do you do? Inquiring Hasidic Jews want to know.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll tell you what you do. You have a woman stand in the mikveh, and she signals to the rabbis that she's gone in. That's how they get around the problem.
Oh, he doesn't look?
Okay, but what's interesting is that in the olden days, with baptism, and if you look at the history of baptism, for example, baptism involved not wearing anything. Because the person who is converted to Judaism or even to Christianity is considered to be like a newborn child. And newborn children are not born with clothes. At least I've never seen any born with clothes. They might be born with a lot of hair, but they're not born with clothes. The clothes are something which are external. So in the world to come, picture the light of God as something that creates intensity. So what happens if you go out in front of the sun without sunscreen or without garments? What's going to happen? You're going to get sunburn. You might even get sunstroke. It could be very dangerous. Okay? Now, so what are the garments that enable the soul to withstand the celestial heavenly light in the world to come?
Amidas?
What?
Amidas?
You're close. It's the mitzvot you do. It's the garments of the soul that represent how you conducted your life. So if a person, for instance, has no good deeds, what happens when they're standing before the divine light in the world to come? You know what happens? They feel like they're burning in hell. And maybe this is where the concept of hell came from souls that were basically unprepared for the light of the divine. And so when we do good deeds, that's what enables us to withstand and bear the light of God in the world beyond. And this idea also occurs in Philo as well, not just the Zohar. Okay, now does that add?
But don't good deeds still have to be tempered by good character? Like
Good,
you can do a
good deeds. Good deeds are sure. If you do good deeds, let's say for instance, you say, you see a poor person on the street, and you offer that person charity. Hey, you moron! Come over here. I have money for you. Hey, let me help you. Let me give you some charity, idiot. Now what happens there? Your good deed. You've insulted them. You destroyed the mitzvah. It would have been better for you not to say anything. than to say a harmful word to another person. So good deeds have to be matched by good intentions.
Rabbi,
Yes.
can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
I thought that I heard you say that Jews believe in a form thrust of hell. Were you saying that?
Ah, now that's a good question. Do Jews believe in hell? Who wants to? Well, I guess let's look at the problems from the point of view of Socrates. What would Socrates say? He said, "Well, you have to define your terms. So, how do we define hell?"
Maybe hell is just bad to do,
You could say hell is estrangement. Hell is alienation that the soul feels from God. Hell is an existence where the soul, where the soul in the next world is all alone, where it has no camaraderie, it has no congenial feelings for anything other than itself.
It's an exile.
Where the soul, it makes you totally self-absorbed. So you could say that is a kind of hell.
I read somewhere once that they said that your dreams will reflect what kind of afterlife you have.
So this is a Jewish belief.
It is a Jewish belief, and now what we call hell generally, at least in Talmudic parlance, is what Christians would probably, from the time of Thomas Aquinas, would identify as purgatory. So who goes to purgatory in Catholic tradition? Babies who are not baptized. Who came up with this idea? Thomas Aquinas. Why Thomas Aquinas? Because Augustine believed that if a baby's not baptized, that baby is going to spend all eternity in hell.
So ridiculous. Not a baby.
Oh, and followers of Augustine's theology went so far in the Middle Ages as to, let's say a woman died in childbirth along with her infant. So you know what they would do? They would cut open the mother's stomach and baptize the baby and then bury the baby.
I've heard about that.
I mean, that's pretty far out when you think about it. This concept does not exist in Judaism. We believe that the soul spends time in purgatory for approximately a year.
We believe that?
Yes. Now, if you look at the Yahrzeit laws, we find something very interesting. What is the law of the Yahrzeit? We say the Kaddish for how many days?
For a year.
No.
30 days?
No.
9?
7.
8?
No, we say Kaddish for 364 days of the year. Why 364 days? Inquiring minds are just dying to know. No pun intended. That was terrible. Sorry, Fernando. Okay, the answer is because we don't want to say that our fathers and mothers didn't go to heaven. The idea that our parents might have ended up in the other place could be construed as disrespectful and impolite. Therefore, we say Kaddish even for the rabbis, even for beloved rabbis like yours truly someday. We say Kaddish for 364 days of the year. I love that teaching. It's a reminder that now the question is, this is a much harder question to answer. So how does time move in the world of eternity? Well, if you ask the Catholic Church, they'll give you a very interesting answer. What will they say? Well, let's ask Galileo and Kepler. How long did they stay in purgatory?
Oh, gosh. 500 years, something like that.
400, 500 years? Until, wasn't it the 1970s, the Catholic Church came out with a with an encyclical. The Pope came out with an encyclical and said, Kepler and Galileo are now forgiven in heaven. God. Now, if you happen to be the soul of Galileo or Kepler, what are you going to say? I can't believe people were such knuckleheads in heaven. On earth, yes. In heaven, inconceivable. All right, let's go. So we understand here the ideas of thought, speech, and action. So, what do you think is the easiest aspect of these garments to control? Your thoughts, your speech, or actions?
I'd say speech.
What do you say, Barbara?
I don't know. I think the whole concept of like heaven is kind of out there. This whole purgatory thing, a little out there. I don't think Jews really believe that.
Well, put purgatory out of your mind. The question is, what if we're looking at thought, speech, and action as categories of behavior?
Thoughts are the most difficult.
Thoughts are the most difficult. Okay, what's second most difficult?
Your speech.
Your speech, obviously. And what is the easiest that we should be able to control?
Your actions.
Our behavior. And so when you look at it from that perspective, we got to remember that the caliber of our soul's ability to experience transcendence, to experience the divine, depends on how we learn, first of all, to control our actions. And even if you're not a good person, but you force yourself to do the right thing, despite bad motivations you might have in doing a mitzvah, you've accomplished something important and wonderful. Because if every human being can learn a little bit of self-control, even if they're not especially pious individuals, wouldn't the world be a better place? Now,
Rabbi,
Maureen, yes, Pauline, what do you want to say?
would you say that, I guess I was looking at it from a different perspective, would you say that self-control and self-discipline are two different things? Because I was thinking, speech is harder, speech is easier than actions because people say good things all the time, like, I'm going to exercise, I'm going to get to the poor, I'm going to do all these things, but they don't actually do the actions to get there. So, it's easier to, say something than to do it, is how I was
All right, well, okay, let me give you a good example. What's one of the most overused expressions in our society today? And when it comes to human relationships?
underused?
What do you say, Gil?
As far as human actions?
What's one of the most overly used expressions?
I love you.
I love you. People say it all the time. Well, if people really love each other, then why do so many relationships break up?
Their actions don't prove it.
This is interesting. Because what happens in love is something very mysterious. You see this particularly of people that surf the internet for meeting new people. You know what happens? You know what happens? People fall in love with their fantasies instead of reality. And so words then become very, very trite because the reality of love demands actions and behavior that reflect love. And just talking about love doesn't cut it. What do you say? Yeah, Barbara, what do you say?
Can somebody just have a really evil soul? I mean, they have no sense of right and wrong. And they just go through life totally selfish.
Okay, so what kind of people would you describe like that?
Well, a lot of people around like that. They only think of themselves.
Give an example.
Isn't that a psychopath?
A psychopath.
Yeah, psychopath or something,
Okay, psychopaths are perhaps a very good example. And so why are people psychopaths? Harder question to answer.
They think they're a victim, and they think.
Okay, well, you could blame it on nurture.
They lack empathy.
If parents fail to instill empathy and compassion to their children, that would probably account for the majority of cases. But what about people who are innately bad?
There is something missing in their brain. There's actually holes in there, and they just don't feel. They don't have a sense of guilt. It's kind of built in, but which is why it's best that they really be put away because they'll continue to repeat their behavior and the antisocial ones. Some people may not be, but when you're antisocial, you never change. There's no getting over it.
You know, there was a very interesting episode once on Star Trek, the original series with Captain Kirk. Do you remember this episode about a machine that was able to reform prisoners by altering the brain chemistry? I thought it was one of the most interesting episodes of the series. What do you think of that, Gil?
Well, I find that a little bit, I don't know, the use of drugs to alter mental states. I mean, powerful psych drugs that I see in the Veterans Administration. That's manipulating your brain chemicals or whatever. But, I mean...
Well, psychiatry is kind of predicated on that to some degree.
Well, but the thing is, how could we be held accountable as a matter of conscience in our relationship with God? If there is something gravely wrong with our brains, that's beyond our control. I mean, you can alter somebody's, you couldn't get angry, you couldn't be aggressive when you're under medication, but when you're off that medication, you want to steer clear.
Okay, there was an interesting case that came up in the news not long ago regarding John Hinckley Jr. Does that name ring a bell?
Mm-hmm. Shot.
Okay, he was the guy that attempted to kill Reagan.
Yeah.
And now, did you know that they released him out of prison?
Yes. 10 years. Yeah.
Okay, this happened fairly recently.
Mm-hmm.
And the belief was that the whatever his brain chemistry might have been in the past has been altered with the help of proper medication. It's an interesting question because could this apply to a lot of the cases that we see today with these mass shootings? Could their behavior be altered artificially through drugs?
I have something that I always wondered.
Yes.
Most people would agree that drug addicts, especially people that use street drugs...
The use of drugs in combat situations is that the drugs that you were given, you had no fear. You can go straight into a combat situation. You have no fear. But when those drugs work down, they're messed up the mind.
Yeah, my question is, after Hinckley, who's going to monitor Hinckley's intake of psychiatric drugs? Yeah, I don't know. These are hard questions to answer. But going back,
is Hinckley taking psychiatric drugs, Rabbi?
What?
Was that in the news? Is he taking psychiatric drugs?
I think he was being medicated. But going back to that Star Trek episode, we may be very, very close, in with medical technology of being able to create a machine that can alter human behavior. And this is not just science fiction. It may become science fact someday. Yes, Gil.
There are certain
yes, Dr. Dunn.
Psychiatric disturbances, for example, bipolar disease or schizophrenia or other psychiatric disturbances, they are greatly, from a benefit standpoint, modified by the use of medication. And so I don't quite understand why people would be concerned about the beneficial effects of medication under these circumstances.
Well, just going back to what we said over here, in terms of, just to conclude our lesson for tonight, because I don't want to go over this, is the concept of garments of the soul teaches us that you have core identity and then you have behavioral identity. And ultimately, how we behave expresses who we are to the world. That's why it's referred to as garments. And that we, because of our roles and positions, and our actions say more who we are and what we stand for than anything else. And our actions should be something that we are able to control. Speech is harder to control because people make, like Pauline said, all sorts of promises, or they use a lot of platitudes, and when it comes to expressing themselves, talk is cheap. And the Bible emphasizes over and over again that a human being is only as good as their word. That's significant. That reflects character. That's an index of character. And then you have thoughts. Now, thoughts are really the hardest part of our ability to control. And we spoke a little bit about the soul and its relationship to conscience, and that God speaks to us through the still small voice of conscience. And learning to discern that is the key to our enlightenment. We also spoke a little bit about Adam and Eve, and falling for the idea that human beings don't resemble God. And that was the deceit, is that every human being is more like God than he realizes. And if we can come to accept that as a reality in our lives, this could motivate us to realize our human and spiritual potential. Are there any other questions on anything that people may have tonight? Any observations? Feel free to speak your mind, speak your truth.
Rabbi,
George, what do you say?
when it comes to soccer, there's a method called the Purgatory method, and it goes like a pyramid. And the bottom one is ball control, and then once you have ball control, then you go to changes of direction, and then feints. And I believe that's how we are supposed to do with ourselves, with our garments. We have to control first the action before we control the speech, before we control the thoughts. That's what I believe.
And the truth is, speech is also a kind of action. And that and because words have power. And when we use words to build people up, it's amazing the transformative power things that we see occur in an individual when we give them positive encouragement. And when we say disparaging things, or happen to be hypercritical of our spouse or our students or whatever, then what happens is what we say has almost incantational power. And so really, in the final analysis, it's important for us to learn how to monitor and manage our actions and our words, what we say to another person. And then we can work on the thoughts, which is probably the most elusive and troubling part for us to really attain control. All right, everyone. Hope you had a good time. And don't forget to make a little donation to the synagogue. Now, you might ask, why are donations important? Well, because we have bills to pay. We just bought a new furnace in the synagogue. Actually, a new air conditioner. And that costs several $1,000s. We have other expenses. So every little bit that you give to help the synagogue goes a long, long way, especially in this hyperinflationary time. But I have good news for you. Giving to a small congregation like Temple Beth Shalom will give you more bang for your buck than money that you give another synagogue that's much larger and prosperous. And may the Schwartz be with you all.
Amen.
And to all, a good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Arlene, you have anything to say?
See you at Shabbat.
See you on Shabbat.
Join us.
Be there or be square.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.